Hey everybody, it's Joe from Tech, and today we're going to talk about the Hifiman Ananda Nano. This is, of course, an open back planar magnetic headphone from Hifiman, and it is a second version of the older Ananda, and it's cheaper. So it's $599 now. It used to be closer to $1,000, and the old model that was that higher price has now been reduced to be even less expensive than this. So I'm going to get right to the point. I don't have the older Ananda. I never reviewed it. I can't directly compare it to that, so I'm really sorry. However, I do have a lot of other planars that have come out more recently that I will be comparing this to hopefully give a picture on how this sounds compared to the others. Now, this was sent to me for review by Hifiman and won't affect what I say about it. I have no kickbacks whatsoever. The links in the description below are generic purchase links, whether it be Amazon affiliate or the Hifiman store, but I have nothing worked out with them, from a monetary standpoint. So I want to talk about these things because this is easy to get out of the way and just discuss. Comes in a brown box, just like all the newer Hifiman packaging. There's really nothing in here because, unlike some of the other Hifiman headphones, it comes with a case. Now this case is actually awesome because it's kind of soft, but it's just big enough to fit the headphone, so you're not wasting space with padding or case size that you don't necessarily need. And I did try this case on the Arya Stealth, the Edition XS, for example, and this case fits them all. So if you are considering buying a case like this separately, it will work. As far as how this is packaged, you do want to remove the cables. You basically just tuck the headband underneath like so, and the unit fits. And then the cord, you kind of just have to stuff in. There's no separate pocket or storage compartment for the wires. So that's one thing I think they could have added, maybe right here, so when you folded it, but it's flexible enough, and as long as you tuck it in carefully, you should be fine. All right, so let's get right into it. The cord is rubber. There's no microphonics. It's a fairly basic cord. There's nothing special about it, but to me, the most important thing is the microphonics and how well the terminations will last over time, because that affects your long-term durability. This is terminated fine. Again, it's just, standard rubber tubing, if you will, or a rubber jacket with gold-plated terminals. And then, of course, you have a removable 3.5 to 6.3 or a 1/4 inch adapter. This cord is long. It's definitely longer than the Deva, I guess it is longer than the Deva, but the Sundara, the Edition XS, even the Arya Stealth, they all have shorter cords in Arya Organic than this. So longer cord than expected. However, it's kind of nice to get that flexibility. If you're using this on the go, I would consider shopping for a shorter cord online. Because this uses a standard 3.5 millimeter terminal, you can buy a lot of different cords, especially if you don't want the 1/4 inch. Maybe you want a 4.4 or a 2.5, depending on what DAC or DAP you're using, in case you ever are using this more in a more portable sense or just have an amp that requires it. All right, so I want to talk about build quality and comforts because, frankly, I don't think it'll take too long, and I do want to compare it to a couple other models. So the Ananda Nano, which the Ananda actually means happiness, is a design that shares the headband style of the Sundara, so that will look extremely familiar, but obviously more of the ear cup design or the ear pad and size of something like the Edition XS. It's the larger planar series, so you're going to have different sonic performance compared to something like the Sundara or the Deva. So without telescoping the yoke, which means extending it, I want to show you the width of this. That's as far wide as I can go in terms of width because I'm limited by the strap. Now, if you have a larger head, this could be a little bit tight or really pushing it. Thankfully, they do have telescoping yokes, so you can extend this and fit larger heads pretty well in terms of height, but not as much on the width. Now, you can see, like, if you take a mental snapshot, this is as far as I can go. Then if I extend the Sundara, and let me make sure, because I have front and back here, this is significantly wider. So they shortened the strap a little bit on the Ananda Nano. Well, I don't know why, but it's just a little bit tighter. Then you have the Deva, or the Edition XS. I keep calling the Deva because the headband reminds me of it because they started with that. So the Edition XS, this thing is absolutely massive. So if you have a large head, maybe you should just consider the Edition XS as your starting point in this price range, especially with the price cuts being under $400. It's an excellent value, and I will compare it in terms of sound quality to these. So this is the largest of the three. The Sundara actually is the second largest for head size. In the Ananda, even though it has a stretchable fork system or telescoping yoke, you are constrained a little bit in the width department. So, I think it's still large enough for a good majority of heads out there. So just keep that in mind. I usually can get it on this or keep it on the smaller setting. It happens to fit my head really well. And just like both of these models, they have a asymmetric pad design. It's not perfectly flat, and that heavier pad on the back, or the thicker pad on the back, helps contour to fit your head a little bit better, because this does not have a rotating yoke at all. They're fixed, and the only rotation comes from the flex of the metal headband, which is spring steel and, this faux leather pad, if you will. It's not uncomfortable, and I actually find the clamp force to be quite nice, again, for my head, because I have a smaller head, and it's just enough to be secure. It's not like a vise, but it's strong enough to maintain a consistent sonic performance too, because if your clamp is too light, it can flop around and move off your head, and it might adversely affect the sound. That happens to me with the Edition XS, because on the smallest setting, it only just fits my head, and it doesn't feel as secure for moving it. Now, when I listen to stuff, I don't wear a hat, but even doing this, I can feel the drivers swinging forward and back a little bit. So the Nano fixes that. The Ananda Nano fixes that for me, and I would prefer this just because of that. So let's talk about sound quality, and I want to start with the objective side first and then kind of roll that into subjective listening, how the measurements translate to what I hear and how that affects my music, movie, and gaming experience. So the Ananda Nano is actually kind of a departure from some of the more traditional Hifiman tuning, because they actually adhered more to the Harman curve than they had in the past, specifically in the 1 to 2K region. It's more filled in. Traditionally, Hifimans have a scoop in that range, which is designed to help create a sense of stage and width. It makes certain things sound thinner or slightly more distant or even recessed, but the end result by altering the tuning that way is it kind of simulates a wider soundstage. That, of course, requires driver matching to be excellent and have no other weird dips and peaks. And, they have their own sound signature, and not everyone likes it, and that's totally fine. So they filled it in, which means that the vocal performance and certain instruments are now more forward and more direct in the mix. And that includes guitars and male and female vocals. Now, the bass shelf was also modified. When you compare it to the Edition XS, the Edition XS is a little bit thicker in the upper bass region. Depending on what you're listening to, it can make the Edition XS come across as a little bit more bass forward, especially when you listen to things like rock music. Now, the Ananda Nano actually has more of a lift in the lower frequencies, and with the larger driver and higher power handling, it means that if you listen to these at louder volumes, higher volumes in general, that bass extension becomes more and more apparent. It's more impactful, especially if you are listening to EDM, trap, hip-hop music, and you want that deeper bass, or even jazz often gets pretty deep depending on the instrument. And I think the Nano stands out. I guess I'll just call this the Nano for now to keep it shorter. I really like the sound presentation as far as the immediacy in the vocals and that extended bass. It suits a lot of things I listen to. However, I do want to address the elephant in the room, and that is the peak or brightness as you approach 7 kilohertz and up. It is a treble forward headphone, just like a lot of other Hifiman products, and some people, again, will like or dislike that. It really comes down to personal preference. For busy rock and metal music, this is not the sound signature I prefer. I would prefer a darker treble tuning with even more emphasized bass carrying into the mid bass to help kind of give me more punch and, I guess, I don't want to say bravado, but more of a sense of power in various guitars. And the way this is suited, it just doesn't fit that genre as well for me. The Edition XS actually performed a little bit better in that regard, as does the Odyssey MM100 or even the FiO FT5. So where this stands out, the detail retrieval is incredible, and that's partly due to the treble tuning. However, if you recess the treble a little bit, and you don't even have to do aggressive EQ here, just to keep it simple, on a 10-band EQ, fixed EQ, I just dropped 8 kilohertz down by 4 decibels. I lifted 32 hertz by 4, and then 64 hertz by 2 or 3 decibels. I think I lifted 125 by 1 or 2 as well, just to kind of mess around with it a little bit. But just simply dropping 8K on a 10-band equalizer, which is a Q of about 1.41 if you're doing parametric, and lifting the bass a little bit, these things sound incredible. Like one of the best performing open backs in terms of sounding good and handling higher power levels or higher volume levels as well. There's the obvious Sennheiser HD 6XO line, the 650, the 600, and the 6XX from Drop. And then you have the new, on the corner of my screen here, the Sennheiser HD 490 Pro, which I'll be reviewing. There's a lot of other headphones that from a tonality perspective are more versatile. They don't have the bass extension that this does. So if you need deep bass, frankly, in this price range, you either have to go to a closed back or an open back planar if you want more power handling for deep bass, louder volumes and deep bass. These things deliver, and they have such a level of texture and clarity to the bass that honestly even makes the Deva, or I keep calling it the Deva in my head because of the headband. The Edition XS sounds great. It doesn't have the bass detail and texture that this does. So if you're listening to it critically, this exposes that rather quickly. Now, James Blake has been reducing some Soundscapes albums, and the Endo Focus Soundscape album has a track called Big Hammer Part 2. And I'll have a picture up on my right here that shows what it looks like. These are just chill tracks. They are very different. There's no real vocal in this particular one, but the soundscape, the stage and imaging that song presents with the bass is mind-boggling on the Ananda Nano. It really felt like this headphone was designed for a track like that. And it made so many other headphones in this price range sound relatively poor and limited in their ability that is the bass texture I was talking about. I switched to the Edition XS, and I like the XS on other tracks more. Like if I listen to rock music without EQ, I would have preferred the XS sound profile. But a song like that, if you're listening to orchestral soundscape, I'm trying to think that like the whole euphoric chill stuff that you play in the background, ambient music, these are just ridiculous. Now, it's further improved to me with a little bit of a EQ down in that 8K region like I was talking about earlier, but it's just something else. The Sundara still does an excellent job, and at almost half the price approximately, I think this represents a better value because it's closer to this in performance than that half point in price. You obviously get diminishing returns with headphones. The biggest difference here is this does have a little bit more detail in the bass region, most notably, but it gets better as you increase the volume. So if you I'm not advising that you crank everything, but realistically, some people do listen to louder music than others. Having a big driver like this gives you more power handling, and it's more apparent with a song like that. Now, as I talk about the sound profile more, I want to start bringing other headphones into the mix because it's important to cover some of these. The Ananda Nano is closer to the Arya Organic than any other sub-$1,000 headphone I've heard, especially with just that mild EQ. It is just ridiculous at how well this headphone performs compared to that. Now, the Sundara is an excellent value. I think these kind of go blow for blow depending on what you listen to because they have just a different tuning. The Sundara is a little bit more forgivable and flexible, whereas the Ananda Nano can have a little bit of lispiness or harshness to it. It almost has like a metallic sounding treble. So if you want a little bit more grit or grain or metallic vibe to your music, depending on the instruments or what your hearing level is like these days, maybe this sound profile will suit you better. If not, like I said, when you EQ it down, the potential is still excellent. I'm going to be reviewing this too, the Moondrop Para. In fact, I also have the FiO FT5. The Moondrop Para is like the Sundara to me, but worse in most cases. And I'll cover this in more detail. I don't want to roast this headphone. I think it's cool that they're doing it. And it has a similar presentation to this with a rolled off sub bass and definitely a more forward bright treble. However, it has a distinct ability of adding some grain. I don't want to say a walkie-talkie effect because I think that's going a little too far, but it approaches more of that sound profile than a more neutral presentation that a lot of these other headphones give you. And you don't have the bass depth that these two give you. It just sounds a little bit drier overall and more brittle. So it's different. I will cover that in more detail later, but for comparing it to something like the Ananda, it's in another level. You have the FiO FT5. Absolutely love the comfort of this. I can wear this headphone all day, and it's $500, so it's in a comparable price range. The FT5 is a thicker, darker presentation. It's actually more of a colored sound presentation than this, even if you include the 8K peak that this has, that bright treble spot. It's thicker in the bass and it's darker in the vocals. So it's a more forgiving sound profile, but some stuff just frankly doesn't have the clarity and poise that this has. Even if you tuned it to be a similar sound profile, the FT5 doesn't quite present the same level of detail retrieval and depth to each note that you hear. Everything sounds a little bit more stunted. Now, it's more forgiving for tracks that are recorded poorly or have a lot of abnormalities in the mix. These hide some of that as a result, but on the audiophile side, if you're really pushing the envelope for detail retrieval and performance, this still has the edge. I do have one more noteworthy mention, and that is the Odyssey MM100. It's the only one I don't have in my possession right now because I sent that one back after my review was done. I will be getting another one and I'll include it physically, but I distinctly remember how that sounds. I measured it and had a lot of time with it. I like the MM100. I think out of the box, aside from the snap snare effect that it has in like the 12 to 14K region and the slight shout in the 3K region, because it's more shouty than the Ananda, it's a great headphone. I think both the MM100 and this benefit from EQ. Now, there is a little bit more of a dampened bass sound to Odyssey in general. They have really good slam after some EQ, and I frankly like the Odyssey sound a little bit more for rock music. The only difference, I guess I would say, is when you push it more, this larger driver handles a little bit more power, similar theme as before, and I think it's more resolving, regardless of what your exact sound profile is. It just seems to extract a little bit more detail out of your mix. So it really kind of depends on what you're going for. These are all good picks in their own right. When you compare it to the Arya Organic, it's just this with another level, because not only do you get that same bass texture I was talking about earlier, but vocals and trebles seems to be better separated for instrumentation. So if you're worried about layering of complex tracks, macro dynamics, that's when you start looking at things like the Arya Organic, the HE1000, all of the higher end planars from Hifiman. So let's quickly talk about gaming and movie listening, and that deep bass extension is more noticeable for stuff like this. If you're concerned with immersion and depth of bass, a larger planar driver like the Arya Organic or the Ananda Nano are going to dig deeper. Explosions sound more like an explosion and less like a bass rumble, and that's definitely apparent when you start gaming on something like this. If you play Call of Duty or a first-person shooter, that metallic sound I was talking about earlier, when you fire a round and the casing ejects out of the rifle, for example, that pinging metallic sound is emphasized on this. So if you game at higher volumes, you may wince a little bit at that particular sound effect, as an example. But if you EQ 8 kilohertz down by a few dB, it kind of takes that edge off, and then you're still benefiting from all the other stuff that this does, which when you're playing games, detail retrieval is extremely important. It's not just frequency response, but you want it to be extremely clear. And this is definitely excellent in that regard. Driver matching is good too, so imaging and localization is great. Soundstage is kind of wide. It's honestly like a more affordable gaming solution to something like the HD800S from Sennheiser, which is like the gaming headphone, at least from a reputation standpoint, or even the Arya Organic and Arya Stealth, which was considered the planar version of the HD800S. This is closer to those, and it's basically half the price or less than half the price. So if you're trying to get to that level of sonic performance for gaming on a budget, get the Ananda Nano, take 8K down a few dB, and it's money. And that same benefit happens for movies. I typically EQ treble down for movies just because I don't want those effects to kind of be too dramatic or in my face, but the bass extension, you can't EQ up with certain headphones. Something like the Sennheiser HD600 series or the 490 Pro, none of those can elevate the deep bass as much as a planar does. So when you have something like this, you can really boost it if you want and get that subwoofer type bass on a headphone, and you kind of need a driver like that to pull it off. Now the Ananda Nano has an impedance of only 14 ohms with a 94 decibel sensitivity rating. It is a little bit harder to drive because big planars like this, they require current. So it's not just an ohm wattage thing. You really have to supply good current in order to get it to sound as good as it can. Now the FiO K11, I'm really late on reviewing this, but I've been using this to test things because it's a more modest, reasonably priced amp DAC solution that I think people are more likely to buy than your flagship stuff from Niche or Shit Audio or all of these other amps that are thousands of dollars. This is an everyday unit. Obviously has a 1/4 inch and 4.4 connection. So This amp at 130 powered this no problem. It got a little bit warm, but I could stay at roughly half volume even at the high, well, in the high gain mode. I could stay at half volume and it sounded excellent, and it handled EQ well with no distortion. So low impedance can be an issue with something like a GC7 from Creative, which has high output impedance, closer to 10 ohms. So the damping factor is pretty bad when you connect it to something like this. Because planar magnetic headphones are fairly linear in their impedance, basically it's a nominal impedance of 14 ohms, but different frequencies can have different impedances, especially when you get into, hybrid IEMs that have a dynamic driver plus a BA or a traditional dynamic driver headphone. The impedance changes with load. And so it's not as bad, even though this is high output impedance and this is extremely low. However, this did stunt the detail retrieval, and I lost a little bit of the treble and bass performance using something like this. Could just be a byproduct of this DAC and less about the output impedance, but get yourself a decent performing clean DAC like this, something with ESS or AKM, and I think it's noticeable improvement, especially over a more inexpensive solution. Okay, so to kind of summarize, there isn't one headphone that's perfect for everybody because we hear different. We have different preferences. We listen to different genres. So I'm never going to say that at this price, this is the best headphone you can get, because it's surely not the case for everybody. It does excel in bass texture. It does excel in layering and instrumentation performance. Where I think it falls back a little bit is your vocal performance, unless you're open to EQ. If you can apply that, then you're benefiting from the ability to handle a various level of genres at various levels of volume, and it's going to reward you in spades on the detail side. For my smaller head, I think the comfort was excellent. However, if you have a larger head, it may simply not be the right headphone for you. So overall, it's a solid option though. I'm glad that they lowered the price of the Ananda because the market's much more competitive now. And I think there is a noticeable gain in performance over all of the other smaller planars, in my opinion, especially if you can tune it to your liking. So that about wraps up the review. I hope you learned something new about the Ananda Nano, and yeah, have a good one. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye.